Okay, we are live. Boa noite a todos. Good evening, Yomi. I will start in Portuguese and then we switch to English. Bom, algumas instruções, alguns avisos. Primeiro de tudo, muito bem-vindos, muito boa noite. Hoje a gente tem mais uma oficina do Laboratório de Estudos do Romance, da FFLS USP, coordenado pela professora Sandra Guardini Vasconcelos e pelo professor Jorge de Almeida. Hoje, originalmente a gente ia ter a mediação da minha colega Mariana Oliveira, mas ela teve um imprevisto, então eu vou ser responsável por isso. A nossa oficina vai ser ministrada inteiramente em inglês, o Yomi vai falar ela. Eu vou ler aqui, enfim, só a introdução que ele mesmo enviou para nós também em inglês. Se vocês tiverem perguntas, podem fazer a qualquer momento da fala, seja em inglês, seja em português, se mandarem uma pergunta em português. Eu vou tentar traduzir, e é isso. Bom, all right. Thank you, Yomi, once again for your presence, for your patience. So I will read your bio and then you may start. Very well. Just one moment. Okay, so today's workshop is called The Naïve and the Sentimentive, Postcolonial Hybridity, Mythopoetic Intention, and the Use of Tradition in Macunaima and the Palm Wine Drinkard. Yomi Folaranmi is a Nigerian Yoruba Igbo writer and artist. He holds a BA in Comparative Literature with Italian and has completed the requirements for an MA in Comparative Literature from University College London. He is broadly interested in mythopoiesis and the global 20th century avant-garde in literature, art, and film. And now I will stay quiet for quite a while. So Yomi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I think I'll begin with a quotation from Edouard Glissant from his Poetics of Relation. And he says, "I return again and again to what I have so long considered the main themes of such a poetics, the dialectics between the oral and the written, the thought of multilingualism, the balance between the present moment and duration, the questioning of literary genres, the power of the Baroque, the non-projectile imaginary construct." This goes a way to introduce the work of Edouard Glissant, and he's a Martinican poet and philosopher, and his preoccupations, which are entirely germane, I think, to the discussion at hand, as well as to comparative literature in general. My idea is that his philosophy of relation embodies the ethos of comparative literature as I see it, with its post-colonial humanist and ecological significance. And I think this is a particularly useful lens through which to see both the theoretical projects of Deleuze and Guattari, whom I'll draw on, and whom Glissant also draws from in his philosophy, as well as the hybrid mythopoetics of Mario de Andrade and Amos Tutuola. The poetics that Glissant speaks of is are the poetics of relation, which foreground the admixture of culture that comes about in a world of modernity and globalization, in a post-colonial world. These poetics, which in the old sense constitute a way of knowing, seek to destabilize binaries and hierarchies. In this way, it is very much, these works are very much de-territorial projects and decolonial projects, with Glissant sharing, among other things, with Deleuze and Guattari, the concept of the rhizome, which sees relations as being network-like, as constituting the roots of a tree, rather than being stratified or disconnected or fragmented. It is radicalism poeticized, literally. I think Glissant, much like Andrade and Tutuola, is concerned not just with literature as such, but with the dichotomy between the oral and the written, with the genres, also with history and the relationship between language, culture, politics, and society. And I think these are the existential concerns for any post-colonial artist. In fact, I think that in speaking of post-colonial modernism, it might amount to tautology, because I think every serious post-colonial artist in engaging with these concerns essentially takes up modernist poetics, because a post-colonial artist in interrogating a unique, complicated history and the forms and conventions that come with that history must end up in innovation, in reinvention, in making it new. Let me move on now to reading the opening passage of Macunaima to see how Mario de Andrade makes it new in a post-colonial context. In the depths of the virgin forest was born Macunaima, hero of our people. He was jet black and son to fear of the night. There came a moment when the silence grew so great, listening to the murmuring Rio Urari Coera, that the native Tapanhumas birthed an ugly child. That child is the one they call Macunaima. Even as a boy, he did bewildering things. First off, he went more than 6 years without talking. If they coaxed him to talk, he'd holler, "Ah, just so lazy," and not a word more. He kept to a corner of the family maloca, perched on the platform of Pachuba palm, watching others work, especially his two brothers, Manape, the geezer, and Jigwe in the prime of manhood. For fun, he'd pick the heads off salva ants. All he did was lie around. The tone in this passage, I think, is immediately identifiable as oral legend. The unidentified narrator speaks in the plural sense, hero of our people. There's a sense of a return to the archaic, to primordial darkness, the trance-like silence out of which Macunaima is born, as if a sudden source of light. But this promise is immediately subverted. There is no radiant child. Instead, he's jet black and son to fear of the night. More than this, he is ugly. There's some strange messiah indeed. The framing of that first paragraph, with its double iteration of Macunaima's name, also serves to add an oral, almost musical, mantra-like quality, which also underscores the centrality of the character to the narrative. The implication of the word even is that he is known for his bewildering actions as an adult. His strangeness has been with him from infancy, it would appear. We also glean something of his character besides his strangeness. He is lazy, self-satisfied, content to let others work, his brothers, and has a callous streak. He decapitates ants for fun. Besides this characterization, there's a sense of place, if not of time. The timelessness, anyway, contributes to the mythic primordial atmosphere. The Uraricoera River marks the location as Brazil, northern Brazil to be precise, as do the strange words maloca, a Chupi word for thatched hut, pachuba palm, salva ant, which show a dedication to ethnographic as well as flora and fauna specificities. The ethnicity of Macunaima's mother, Tapanumas, serves a similar function. Tapanumas actually is the Chupi word for people of African descent. So we realize that at the same time that Andrade is invoking the Aboriginal Amerindian Brazilians, he's also already thematizing racial mixedness. From this idyllic quasi-domestic setting, the narrative unfurls. Macunaima quickly gets off to mischief, which leads to his being proclaimed intelligent by King Nago, which is the Brazilian incarnation of the Yoruba deity, Shango, god of war. This is yet another instance of Andrade's worked-in syncretism. The shenanigans thus sanctioned continue. The hero disregards infancy and transforms by means that are never explained into a prince to cockle his brother Jigwe. He copulates with cartoonish violence with his brother's wife, Sofara, who is supposed to be looking after the baby. He's eventually found out and punished. But this does not put an end to his wanton behavior. Jigwe gets another wife, Irikwe, whom Macunaima seduces just as well. This mischief continues for the rest of the opening chapter, which it is impossible to summarize comprehensively. Some highlights include Macunaima transforming prematurely into a full-grown man, once and for all, and an encounter with a cannibal forest deity, Macunaíma's accidental killing of his own mother, who had been transformed into a deer by an evil spirit. Lots of crazy things like that happen in the rest of the book. The chapter ends after establishing the cultural syncretism, the Brazilian context of the narrative, the oral style full of cartoonish violence and slapstick, the unexpected and quickly moved on from pathos, the dynamic of the brothers, Macunaíma's laziness, mischief, and wantonness, his brother's complicity and suffering, as well as the tropes of trickery, metamorphosis, and cannibalism, with the characters leaving their village to face the modern world. It ends, then Macunaima took Irikwi, Irikwi took Manape by the hand, Manape took Jigwe by the hand, and the four of them set out for this wide world. It may already be evident from the summary of this first chapter. Macunaima is far too multi-layered to be summarized without grave omissions. It is a tightly woven tapestry of polysemous events and motifs. However, a rough summary might describe the plot as being driven by Macunaíma's desire to retrieve a talisman, the Muira Kitang, which is given to him by the forest deity Si, who somehow ends up getting married to his wife, who ascends to the skies after their child dies tragically in a surprisingly moving episode. He loses this talisman, the emotional center of the story, I would say, which falls into the possession of a Peruvian-Italian giant merchant and collector known as Wenceslao Pietro Pieta, aka the Cannibal Piaiman, who is a negative symbol of foreign influence, who is also derived from folklore, from Peruvian folklore. In his quest to recover the talisman, Macunaima crisscrosses a Brazil teeming with animals and plants, teeming with deities and spirits. He encounters the modernized São Paulo with all the effects and accoutrement of modernity, cars, policemen, so on, telephones. And eventually he manages to kill Pierre, but he loses the amulet again and loses his brothers. And in the end, broken and desolate, he tells his story to a parrot before ascending to the stars on a jack and beanstalk-like magic plant to become Ursa Major. The parrot then narrates the story to an unnamed man who in the end addresses the reader. And that man is me, folks, and I've stayed behind to tell you this tale. That's why I came here. I crouched down on these leaves, picked my ticks, started strumming my guitar, and in this rugged tune and impure speech, I've sung these cares to the world, telling all the sayings and doings of Macunaima, hero of our people. And that's all. Them might know. In this closing passage, there is the refrain, Macunaima, hero of our people, an echoing of the same phrase in the opening paragraph. The narrative is circumscribed, and the orality of the tale is underscored and re-emphasized in a self-reflexive manner. The image of the musician sitting down with his instrument to sing the tale is a direct invocation of the traditional image of the bard or the griot. The description of the tale as being recounted in a ragged tune and impure speech is an ironic self-conscious description of the synthetic protean Brazilian Portuguese that Mario de Andrade has used in his composition. A few years before Macunaima was published, Vom Roroima Zumorinoko, published in 1924 by the German ethnographer Theodor Koch-Grunberg, was an account of the Aboriginal Pemon and Ara people based around the northern Amazon. In the second volume, he transcribed a cycle of stories related to him by Mayulaipu, a Tuarapeng, and Moisewaipu, a young Akuri shaman who spoke no Portuguese. These stories, as Katrina Dodson explains in her notes to her English translation published last year, they interweave origin myths full of fateful acts with a ribald, gross-out humor that marks drunken storytelling across cultures and eras. In short, the stories came to Mario de Andrade as an already set-down classic of world orature. A central character in these legends, of course, was a complex Pemon trickster anti-hero, Macunaima, spelled with a K rather than a C, as Andrade's Macunaima is, who lends several of his characteristics to Mario de Andrade's own Rascal. Andrade was struck by the Pemon trickster's lack of character, which is to say he lacked not only moral consistency, but also a coherent fixed characteristics. He was a floating signifier. He was a perfect receptacle within which to inject an imagined sense of Brazilian character. Essentially, as a floating signifier, which is say he could mean whatever he wanted him to mean, he was the perfect solution to the search, to the Brazilian modernist search, which was influenced by motivations of cultural retrieval, race retrieval, post-colonial self-affirmation. The search for a model upon which to build national character, which I think preoccupied Andrade existentially and as a modernist. Suffice to say, Andrade's imagination was arrested and his creative reaction unfolded rapidly. He began composing his version of Macunaima literally in the margins of Grunberg's book. And in fact, as Luisa observes, there's already been a study of his marginalia in the copy of the volume, which traces his improvisations. The first draft was legendarily completed over 6 days in a state akin to intoxication, a state of prepared possession, as he called it, a preparedness stemming doubtless from long-term intellectual gestation and preoccupation. In fact, I must emphasize Andrade's polymathic, polyglottic standing in the center of the Brazilian modernist movement. He was an amateur musicologist, ethnologist. He traveled within the Amazon basin, collected folklore. He was an expert in Brazil, both modern or contemporary to him and historical. From this intellectual gestation, he proceeded to expand his draft, interpolated the narrative with stories collected from other mythological tradition, elements of pop culture, as well as jokes, rhymes, sayings, and superstitions, a compulsive transformation and intertextualization which continued even after the publication of the novel in 1928, as Dodson reports. It is a musical episodic epic, Macunaima, as Andrade called it. It is uma rhapsodia, a rhapsody. Like the innovations in Andrade's earlier works of poetry, it is a remarkably harmonious work of poetry which has strong roots in the oral tradition Andrade cribbed from, and not just in folklore, but also the oral tradition of everyday speech, with all the jokes, swear words, and catchphrases one might hear in a chaotic post-colonial hybrid nation. Ezra Pound claims that the epic is a poem including history. Well, Macunaima is a poem including everything from history to folklore, to literature, to geography, to botany, to wildlife, to popular culture, music, not just from Brazil, but actually the entire world that Andrade had access to. And with its iconic protagonist, a traveler and scholar of multiple races, just like its author, who undergoes a universal kind of quest through the Amazon and urban Brazil with all the strange artifacts of modernity, it is finally an embodiment of both the modernist experimental ideals and the nationalist impulse of Brazilian modernism. And it is a riveting story, I should say. It's told in its insistent, distinctive, evocative language, musical language, with a macabre, careening sense of humor underflowing the language, full of cartoonish set pieces that point to the technique of a comic genius. It's also at points full of pathos. These things, I am tempted to suggest, would not have been brought together, could not have been made possible, made manifest, without the uniquely qualified erudition of a writer of mixed origins, who was situated at the right time in history, with a large dollop of talent, as Mario de Andrade had. It's important to dwell somewhat on this question of language, which is central to Andrade's nationalist poetic intentions, in a way that calls to mind Dante's experiments in vulgar eloquence, which say the synthesizing of Italian dialects for the sake of nationalist poetry, Andrade tried in Macunaima to represent a valorized spoken Brazilian Portuguese with its unique syntax and rhythms, merging speech and songs, rhymes and slangs from popular culture to reflect a natural hybrid flavored by European, Amerindian, and African influences, which did not enjoy the prestige of formal Portuguese. Andrade's preoccupation with these linguistic issues come up again and again in his narrative like a leitmotif. Here it is in the first instance, Macunaima's first utterance and catchphrase, "Ai que preguiça," which Dodson has translated as, "Ah, just so lazy," which, besides being a succinct description of the hero's disposition, is a bilingual pun marrying the Chupi and Portuguese words for sloth, "ai" and "preguiça." This is just one example of the poetic punning potential of Brazilian, which Andrade exploits elusively in a way similar to James Joyce or Cesar Vallejo in his crafting of his narrative, which are so multifarious that it would be impossible to catalog them here. Language, of course, is just one of the primary rules of the trickster who can influence reality and the minds of others by persuasion or outright lying. Otherwise, he can entertain with jokes or stories to shock and scandalize. Despite these achievements, the reception of Macunaima was not straightforward and amounted in many ways to a misunderstanding, a gross misunderstanding of the work. Incompreensão das artes do usucapião linguístico, Santiago puts it, in comprehension of the arts of linguistic usucaption. The archaic word usucaption refers to the process in the times of the Roman Empire of acquiring ownership of a property by undergoing a period of uninterrupted possession. It's a striking description of Andrade's decolonial taking possession of the Portuguese language, which of course mirrors the Brazilian as an abstract figure taking possession of the colonial language, as well as of the various traditions which Andrade and Brazil in general appropriates. Well, the very first review, which was anonymous, highlights the blending of folklore with popular culture and the satirization of Brazilian society, while criticizing its crudeness. The hasty summation of the book as one of the most original works of our literature, that's what the review says, one of the most original works of our literature, has led to the theory that Andrade himself wrote that. This was especially given the fact that other critics reacted negatively. While picking up on the syncretism and relevance to nationalist modernism, they variously derided the book's crudeness, pornographic elements, and sense of disorganization. One critic called it a talented blunder. But most damning of all was the suggestion that Mario de Andrade had plagiarized his work from Koch-Grünberg. In fact, this was an accusation he embraced wholeheartedly, explaining in an open letter to Raimundo Moraes, who had defended him. "Yes, I copied, my dear defender. And not just Koch-Grünberg, he copied everyone," as he said, "even the whole of Brazil." The significance of this is clear and shows exactly what the critics misunderstood. The very things which they criticized were the strategies Andrade used to assert his innovation and originality, his decolonial cannibalization of culture and traditions, to use that word, which I don't really like, to invoke Oswaldo de Andrade's manifesto. I avoid the metaphor of cannibalism because I think it's overdone and unduly restrictive, though it does have its uses. Let me now turn to Amos Tutuola and the palm wine Drinkard to see how an ostensibly unintentional artist comes to a similar achievement, despite similar critical misunderstanding, before my final comparison of the two works. The opening passage of Tutuola's palm wine Drinkard introduces us, without much ado, to the unmistakable, irreverent, dryly humorous narrative voice with whom we'll continue for the rest of the Orphic narrative. He says, "I was a palm wine Drinkard since I was a boy of 10 years of age. I had no other work than to drink palm wine in my life. In those days, we did not know any other money except cowries, so that everything was very cheap. And my father was the richest man in our town. I was drinking palm wine from morning till night and from night till morning. By that time, I could not drink ordinary water at all except palm wine. But when my father noticed that I could not do any work more than to drink, he engaged an expert palm wine tapster for me. He had no other work than to help me tap palm wine every day. Thus, we are furnished with an immediate image of a good-for-nothing sybarite, a spoiled brat, immediately comparable to the indolent, prodigious, precocious Macunaima, enabled by his wealthy father, whose relationship with other people, his family, his tapster, his friends, appears to be dictated by his enormous appetite for palm wine. At the same time, we encounter from the very first sentence a narrative voice which is peculiar, ungrammatical, non-standard, such that my word processor protested with blue and red underlining when I copied out the above passage. The word Drinkard, first of all, resembles the kind of neologism readers of James Joyce or Cesar Vallejo will be acclimatized to. In the place of the more common alternatives like drunk or drinker or drunkard, which in their own ways fall strangely on the ears anyway, but not as much as this new word, drinkard, which somehow we do not stumble over. The significance of the word is somehow immediately clear. This is no ordinary drunk. This is one who has become so adept in the profession or lifestyle of drinking that the normally expected ill effect of inebriation is rendered irrelevant. Indeed, nowhere in the narrative does a drunkard suffer from hangover or drunken stupor. It is truly a new word which signifies something unique. Then there's a strange syntax. Since I was a boy of 10 years old, since I was a boy of 10 years of age, it sounds oddly stilted and archaic, even tautological. Why not instead, since I was 10 years old, or even something like, I'd been a palm wine drinker since I was 10. There's a phrasing which is repeated such that it becomes almost a mantra or statement of identity. I had no other work than to drink palm wine in my life. Similarly, his tapster had no other work than to tap palm wine every day. There's the unwieldy use of the imperfect tense. I was drinking palm wine from morning till night and from night to morning. There's the out of place typography in cowries, which is typed in all caps. Which is an unusual enough word, which draws more attention to itself for its capitalization and exoticizes the narrative. All these things combine to an effect of enchantment, an invitation to partake in a narrative which is strange or exotic even, but which somehow encourages a suspension of disbelief for how self-confidently the narrative is relayed. And of course, it gets stranger. From this description of enabled hedonism, with the narrator daily imbibing Rabelaisian amounts of palm wine tapped by his dutiful tapster from his expansive palm tree farm of 560,000 trees, we soon face an unfolding of the primary dilemma in the plot. 15 years after he was engaged in his employment, the palm wine tapster falls from a tree and dies. The narrator's immediate reaction is to climb a palm tree, tap some wine for himself, and then drink to his satisfaction before burying his dead tapster. After this incident, his primary remorse is that he has lost his supply of palm wine and must deign to drink water, which does not quite satisfy him as much as palm wine. He is abhorrently selfish. But somehow, we are not invited to judge him. In any case, this is the catalyst for a voyage to the land of the dead to retrieve his tapster, a quest that seems farcical compared to the solemn Orphic paradigm of braving the underworld to rescue one's lover, for example. It'd be impossible to summarize the rest of the narrative here, but suffice to say, the narrator encounters spirits, strange creatures, a gang of skulls, mystical old men and women, a benevolent evil death himself, a ravishingly beautiful gentleman who turns out to be a skull, who has only rented his body parts. He gets married to a naive woman who turns out to have unexplained prophetic powers, with whom he conceives a monstrous child who is born out of his mother's thumb, and who has a gargantuan appetite that is almost a moral corruption of his father's hedonism, and which he must later abandon after failing to exterminate. There are similarly anatopic references to aspects of modernization: guns, bombs, a disco within a tree, photography, telephones, And Tutuola treats these in the magical realist mode as being almost as fantastic, these elements of modernity, being almost as fantastic, and in fact, being part of the same mystical topography of the spirits and monsters, etc. All these things a Drinkard weathers and survives, not so much by virtue of his wit, which comes through in his simple narrative voice more as commonsensical shrewdness than low cunning. Besides his being aided by unexplained pure luck or iterations of divine intervention, as well as his ever-handy juju magic, which allows him transform himself and others into a variety of objects. After many adventures and weird encounters which evoke surprising empathy and existential reflection, the Drinkard manages to locate his tapster in the aptly named Dead's Town. The tapster dolefully informs the Drinkard that having learned the ways of the dead, he cannot be expected, naturally, to return to the land of the living. This amounts to a kind of existential moral lesson. In the end, partially with the help of a magical egg, which provides unlimited food, and of course palm wine gifted to him by the dead tapster as a parting gift, he returns home and saves his town from famine, which has come about because of a feud between heaven and land, as you do. By this final act, he is cemented as a hero who has learned through his struggles not to be so selfish and self-involved. With its strange language, its mythopoetic structure, and its blend of the modern and the mystical, it amounts to a hybrid work with post-colonial implications similar to Macunaima. It is an undeniable achievement, and yet, did Tutuola really mean it in a way we can say of Mario de Andrade? Did he mean it, this curious literary achievement? Was this what he was setting out to achieve, this mythopoesis, this post-colonial hybrid text? Like many who are born into lowly provincial circumstances, Tutuola's life unfolded with certain picaresque undertones, such that it doubtless was connected to the vicissitudes in his writing. He was born as grandson of an Egba chieftain in western Nigeria in the Yoruba township of Abeokuta in 1920, 2 years before the publication in 1922 of the landmark works of Anglophone modernism, The Wasteland and Ulysses, 8 years before Macunaima, 2 years after the end of the First World War, 19 years before the start of the Second World War, 40 years before the independence of Nigeria from the British Empire. In his early years, he lived as a houseboy in Lagos, seat of the colonial powers in Nigeria, serving his master in exchange for school tuition at the Salvation Army Primary School. Reportedly an exceptional student, he was promoted 2 classes ahead twice. His promising education in Lagos was, however, terminated when he fled home to Abeokuta to avoid maltreatment by one of his master's other servants. There he lived with his father, who struggled to pay his school fees and maintenance costs, such that he resorted to such frugal measures as stowing away on a lorry to avoid transport fares to school. On one of these escapades, heroically in search of education, he was discovered and beaten, resulting in a distinctive pitted scar on his forehead above his left brow, which is a mark of character, I think, upon an otherwise benevolent mien, and a mark indeed on his frustrated desire frustrated desire for formal education. He continued with his education until his father's death in 1939. Unable to afford to continue, he was forced to drop out and become a farmer. He failed in this endeavor. Didn't have no green fingers, and he flitted between petty trades until he eventually learned the trade of smithery. In 1939, he joined the West African Air Corps of the RAF as a coppersmith. After his contribution to the war effort, finding no other occupation in the customary post-war employment drought, he settled for the menial role of messenger at the Department of Labor. As he says this much in his afterword to Palm Wine Drinkard. It was dull work and, in his own words, unsatisfactory, so that he was left in a perpetual state of boredom. This was fortuitous, as fate would have it. It gave him enough time and lease of imagination to compose the Palm Wine Drinkard, which he completed in a few days, and which was to be his first masterwork. He had, prior to this, completed another story, with similar mystical themes, which remained unpublished. Thus, we have this marvelous surreal narrative as an antidote in its conception to acedia. Eventually, the book found its way, the manuscript found its way to Faber and Faber in London to be considered for publication by none other than the Grand Old Duke of Modernism himself, T.S. Eliot. And the rest, as we say, was literary history. Upon the publication of his story, he became, for better or worse, the first famous Nigerian writer. Faber and Faber actually did not know what to make of the book when it first crossed their desks. They first considered publishing it with an anthropological introduction and as a narrative that would shed light on the West African mind. It is evident that the novel was conceived as being of more value as an anthropological artifact, a native curiosity, rather than a work of real intentional literary value. This for all the enchantment of the narrative. Typical. This meant, for better or worse, for the sake of authenticity, the publishers were reluctant to edit the manuscript too much, contravening actually Tutuola's self-conscious request that his wrong English be ratified. This reluctant attitude indeed resulted in the establishment of the title as Drinkard, that famous word, rather than drunk or drunkard. The uniqueness of the curiosity is also reflected in T.S. Eliot's somewhat infantilizing comments on the prospects of Tutuola publishing a book afterwards, which are surely worth recounting. Eliot said, "I'm rather apprehensive of Mr. Tutuola's turning out a problem child. I fear that the public appetite for this line of fiction must be satisfied with one book and not with others." The ambivalent attitude towards the value of Tutuola's book is also legible in the inclusion of a facsimile of the author's handwritten manuscript in his quaint cursive handwriting with the bare minimum of editor's notes to assure of its authenticity and integrity as an untampered with artifact. So the manuscript was published actually in the final version of the novel. This approach, with its fetishistic and exoticizing undertones, refuses to take Tutuola completely seriously as a writer, while admitting implicitly that there was some value in his work. The reviews, the earliest Western reviews, which were for the most part laudatory, followed a few of these ambivalent tropes. The most famous, that of Dylan Thomas for The Observer, describes a brief, thronged, bewitching story written in what he condescendingly tagged young English. He's about a drinkard who drinks so much palm wine because it's just what the witch doctor ordered. Actually, there's no mention of any witch doctor in Tutuola's book. Such stereotypes abound in most of the Western reviews, but most of them do admit that it is a bewitching narrative indeed, is enthralling and enchanting. But they seem to suggest that Tutuola was not in control of what he was doing. He didn't know quite what he achieved. On the other hand, in Africa, early African reviewers of Tutuola's work have mostly been perceived as having been against the publication of the book, in the trend Beth Force describes as local embarrassment. Wale Soyinka, writing in 1963, says sardonically in an essay where he defends Tutuola, in fact, a very long time ago, the discerning African rejected the anthropological novel. These were, in fact, for the very same reasons that the Western reviewers found the book so charming: its ungrammatical language and its mystical subject matter. This rejection seems to have come from a bristling self-consciousness about primitivistic views of Africa from intellectuals who wish to avoid stereotypes and assert their modernity. My own conviction is that these points of criticism are, while ideologically understandable, unfair because they tend to decenter the agency of the writer and confirm the myth of a naïve who either stumbled upon a gold mine, otherwise a simpleton who, in writing rubbish, was a pawn for the racist Western agenda, I wish to argue that even though Tutuola was self-conscious about his apparent deficiencies in the English language and in his lack of knowledge of Western literary history, his achievements as an assembler of oral tradition, and indeed as a writer who was in a conscious literary tradition, as a pioneer of a new idiom and genre, mark him as an ideal postcolonial hybrid artist, similar to Mario de Andrade, whose technique and vision must be lauded. I can't go into much detail at the moment, although I may get a chance to talk about that later, of Tutuola's influences and his relationship to the Yoruba writer Diofagunwa. But I'll go straight ahead to talking about what I mean by the naive and the sentimental. So besides the racial and colonial hegemonies, the classism, involved in the reception of Tutuola's work is a dimension worthy of study in itself. Indeed, perhaps the most impassioned defender of Tutuola, Taban Loliong, has explicitly defended him along these lines. Is he ungrammatical? Yes. But Joyce is more ungrammatical than Tutuola. Has Joyce not done more damage to the English language? Essentially, what we have is a working class, not completely literate writer who was seen variously by patronizers as a curiosity, not totally aware of his achievement, and by detractors as an upstart or as a useful idiot who was not aware he was being used as a pawn to confirm a racist agenda. One senses even a strain of envy. These two classes of people obviously held themselves as more literate, better educated than him, and thus in a superior position to judge his work. Is this not the damning conceit of most critical stances, actually? The revenge of the intellect upon the imagination, to paraphrase Susan Sontag. On the other hand, with Mario de Andrade, the Pope, the so-called Pope of modernism, although the acceptance of his work was not universal, there does not seem to be quite the same whiff of condescension. His failures or successes, whatever they may have been perceived by convention to be completely willed or intentional. Whatever he suffered from, it was certainly not linguistic or intellectual inadequacy. His intentions as an artist were from the start respected and taken for granted in a way that Tutuola's were not. Martin Seymour Smith, who for his own part describes Tutuola as simple-minded, while in the same breath praising his wonderful imagination, gives us a very useful rubric for understanding the supposed dichotomy between these two writers. That is to say, the dichotomy between the naive and the sentimental. I've already used the word naive in a general sense, which is clear enough in its meaning. It simply denotes an untrained artist, and artist lacking formal training, that's to say. However, Seymour Smith's idea, tucked away in the introduction to his tome on 20th century literature, is a concept which he has derived, throwaway concepts, which I find very invaluable, actually. He has derived from Friedrich Schiller, who in his Über naiv und sentimentalisch Dichtung, as Seymour Smith understands it, points to a division between two tendencies. On one hand, an artist who, in a way characteristic of the ancients, is in perfect harmony in nature, and who, through his natural representational talents, cannot be found in his work. I interpret this to mean that he is not a self-reflective artist, that his work seems to come about almost spontaneously, naturally, bidden by the muse. That's the naive artist. On the other hand, the sentimentive artist is everywhere present. He's self-conscious. He's stitching and unstitching, to use Yeats's phrase. His conscious working of his art is palpable. Modifying Schiller's idea somewhat, Seymour Smith argues that the naive writer derives his inspiration from his unsophisticated, uncomplicated, direct view of the universe. His view is uncluttered by intellectualization. On the other hand, the sentimentive writer is a writer who is sophisticated, trained in thinking, and self-conscious. Seymour Smith retains a necessary sense of subtlety and irony in his theory, though, making the point that no artist is ever fully naive or sentimental, sentimentive, Indeed, the irony of modernism is such that the sentimentive modernist eventually emphasizes his modernity by turning to naivety. This is what we call primitivism. From this basis, it is not difficult to see how this dichotomy, with all the concomitant ironies, applies to our consideration of Andrade and Tutuola, who Seymour Smith in fact described as naive. In the same place he called him simple-minded. That's Tutuola. On one hand, we have the consummate modernist, Andrade, the controversial polymath, who cannibalized his vast intellectual resources and experience to create a modernist epic. And on the other hand, the humble messenger scribbling his stories out of boredom, who also in fact created a modern epic. But it is possible, I think, and we'll round up in 5 minutes, to problematize the view of Tutuola as naive somewhat. I have demonstrated already my description of the story. Tutuola's masterfully evocative use of rhetoric, as well as blending of the folktale with modern imagery. This shows some skill, I think. I regret I'm not able to go into more detail with actual passages from the book in this setting. Even if Tutuola might not have been able to explain his technique in critical language, there's a sense that he knew what he was doing. However intuitively this knowledge might have come about. And indeed, the impression that his work came spontaneously and without self-consciousness or correction is false. As Mukoma Wangugi observes, he spoke himself of a creative process which involved sketching out his stories and then expanding them, this coming after a gestation period. Elsewhere, he's described by his son as compulsively collecting stories on a tape recorder, most of which he never used, actually. Is this so different? Really from Mario de Andrade's method? Even with the question of his unwieldy, self-conscious misuse of the English language, there's a suggestion that he was indeed aware of the apparent damage he was doing to the language. He said, I used the language, I used the Yoruba, I used the English language the way the Yoruba speak their language in English as well. Though it is wrong to use it in English, though it's not good or correct grammar, but I use it like that. That is the Yoruba dialect, the way we speak. It is wrong, but I use. They understand what I mean by that. These are words from an interview. They suggest, yes, an inferiority complex, but also a sense of resignation and resolution. He had decided by this point to write the best way he knew how, and he seemed to be aware of the effects of his ungrammatical English. Powerful effects, actually. Charming, enchanting effects. Moreover, in the same place, he expresses a distrust in the same interview in translations of Yoruba, interestingly citing Wole Soyinka's translation of Dio Fagunwa, the Yoruba novelist, as an example of one translation in which the flavor of the Yoruba was lost. For his own part, I try my best not to affect my stories in English. Though it's not my language, I adopted it. I try my best to use it in a way that it does not affect my story. This shows a certain level of critical awareness, surely. And if anything, his recorded desire to improve his control over his work, which is not so different from Mario de Andrade's efforts in Macunaima. Above all, there is the overarching question of Tutuola's purpose in his writing. Yes, he may have written out of boredom, but he was also writing, as he claimed, out of a desire to preserve the stories and cultures of his people. More than this, in the sense of a literary tradition, he saw himself as coming from Fagunwa and Yoruba culture, and begetting a line of Nigerian writers, especially Yoruba writers like Soyinka, Andrew Ladipo, as well as non-Yoruba writers like Chinua Achebe, whom he influenced to write about their traditional culture as he saw it. This is not dressed up in the nativist modernism of Andrade, nor even the African equivalent in negritude, but it's possible to see that the aims were, in the end, broadly the same. So we find that despite the dressing, if the words of a humble writer are to be taken seriously after the fact, and why should we take them any less seriously than Mario de Andrade's prefaces and letters and the Cannibalist Manifesto and so on and so forth? Tutuola was in fact more of an intentional artist than may be immediately apparent. As such, we are encouraged to view the significance of his work together with Mario de Andrade in a more direct way. My final point T.S. Eliot says that one of the surest tests of an artist is in the way in which a poet borrows. Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal, bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different. Both Mario de Andrade and Tutuola have been accused of plagiarizing, but as we have seen, they have not merely copied, they have borrowed, as all artists are wont to, but have mixed what they took from others they've mixed them up into evocative, compelling wholes. They have made what they borrowed into something better, or at least something different, to borrow from T.S. Eliot's words again. Eliot's work, Tradition and the Individual Talent, is seminal enough not to require much rehashing, but the pertinence to the matter at hand is clear. In order for an artist to fully realize themselves, they must contend with what has come before, and in assimilating this, create something new. For an artist to be truly avant-garde, they must reconcile the past with its present. This is not a given. No one is born with tradition. One must work for this consciousness. But the success of the artist is necessarily to do with learning the success of the artist is not necessarily to do with learning either, as we are reminded. T.S. Eliot says, Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. Which is to say, the success of an artist in the end ultimately has to do with talent and a particular facility for absorbing material. We see this with Andrade. We see this perhaps to an even greater degree with Tutuola, who was working with far meaner resources. We see in an artist who absorbs and transforms tradition in the mature perfection of his work, a continual extinction of personality, C.S. Eliot says. In Seymour Smith's terms, a continual move towards naivety or primitivism. By Eliot's criteria, I would suggest, Tutuola is a superior artist, a judgment which I am prejudiced towards, maybe as a Nigerian, if this is not already evident. But literature is not a horse race. This subjective ranking is not the point of this essay. There's also, of course, embedded in this discussion of tradition and innovation, the political dimension. For the question of tradition, according to Eliot's Eurocentric framing, is not so clear-cut for post-colonial individuals who must contend with seemingly disparate traditions which are placed on a hegemonic scale. It's a question which is answered partly by Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s concept of signifying, playful parody and pastiche. But Gates is not entirely satisfactory here because he's focused on a Black American theory of literature, and as such is primarily concerned with the intertextuality between Black text, which actually could apply here. On the other hand, the cannibalist readings of Mario de Andrade are interesting for the recognition of the author's indiscriminate cannibalization of texts such that a hybrid is created. This is what Homi Bhabha has described as a third space, the hybrid, which constitutes, in his words, the discursive conditions of enunciation that ensure that the meanings and symbols of culture have no primordial unity or fixity, that even the same signs can be appropriated, translated, rehistoricized, and read anew. In other words, the third space, the hybrid, is a naturally subversive locus for ambiguity and a destabilizing of hierarchies and notions of purity. In recognizing that there was no chance for cultural purity in Brazil, the Brazilian modernists got it right. Instead of discarding tradition, they sought to take the best of both worlds, to syncretize culture and language, European, African, Portuguese, modern and primitive, in order to create something new and unique. Thus, they resolved the post-colonial question, I think, of tradition, the nexus of which we have seen in Macunaima, the nexus and the high point we have seen in Macunaima. Incidentally, despite not having the same artistic or intellectual milieu or wherewithal, we also see this in Tutuola's Palm Wine Drinkard. To emphasize this post-colonial subversive relevance, I wish to conclude at long last by arguing that Macunaima and Palm Wine Drinkard are to a certain degree both examples of minor literature. Deleuze and Guattari famously introduced this concept in their study of Kafka towards the minor literature, in which they set out 3 determinative criteria. They say the 3 characteristics of minor literature are: 1, the deterritorialization of language; 2, the connection of the individual to a political immediacy; and 3, the collective assemblage of enunciation. They say, we might as well say that minor no longer designates specific literatures, but the revolutionary conditions for every literature within the heart of what is called great or established literature. It's necessary to expand a bit. By deterritorialization, Deleuze and Guattari mean a subversive approach to language, a taking away of language from its original territory into a radical, submissive new territory. Kafka, their instigator and prime example, reterritorializes German because he writes in this language that is not historically his, a language that is historically the language of his oppressors. And he gives German a new intensity by appropriating it. This is similar to Irish writers historically colonized by English, Joyce in English and all the other languages he manipulates, Beckett in English and French. In this language, in this spirit, rather than giving a fixed point for minor literature, he provides a direction, Kafka does, which we can proceed towards. Naturally, this leads to the second point, that minor literature is political. The very act of using a hegemonic language, be it English or Portuguese, by a minority within that language is in itself a political act. It is inherently politically interesting. And the third characteristic, what they call collective assemblage of enunciation, connects the author of the individual work to the struggle for a voice or an identity of his milieu at large. It's easy enough to see how both Macunaíma and the palm wine Drinkard fall into this schema. In the first instance, there's the deterritorialization of language in both of them. In Macunaima, it's a refashioning of Brazilian Portuguese in order to break from the hegemony of European Portuguese. In the palm wine Drinkard, it's fashioning of an ungrammatical English with Yoruba undercurrents, which are relevant not just to the author's projects, but to their wider communities and historical post-colonial context. We see this too in the fashioning of essentially new genres out of disparate traditions, which destabilize hierarchies between the oral and written, the modern and the ancient, the original and the innovative. Indeed, the word assemblage is extraordinarily pertinent, for both works are assemblages of diverse materials by these two artists who managed to weave them together in a way that is relevant for their societies at large, even if these achievements were not initially recognized for what they were. That is to say, Macunaima and the palm wine Drinkard, being hybrid works of art which signify traditions, both serve as vehicles for the political task of decolonization, which of course are of relevance to a far greater scope than just the author's projects, but in fact are more examples in this ideal of the revolutionary power of world literature. I suggest that this last point perhaps frees me from a charge that my point of view may be held guilty of, which is the intentional fallacy. I've taken it largely for granted that the author's intentions and even their biographies are relevant to the significance of the works at hand. After critics like Barth, who have argued that the meaning of the text is not necessarily limited to what the author might have intended, or said the author is dead, in fact, I think this imposes a kind of limitation on the text and is open to interpretation. But how is my point of view conscionable? I suggest that my approach is not so incompatible with the spirit of minor literature, which in the end embraces polysemy and eschews limitations. But on the other hand, I wish to insist on the importance of the author in post-colonial context. The text does not come out of a vacuum. It is carried forth by a colonial subject, post-colonial subject, who operates within a hierarchy. This process of carrying through of translation is surely of concern, as is the medium in both senses of the word, both the medium, the creative medium, as well as the artist himself as a medium. What is gained by eliding the backstories of the text, which include the authors who intended them? Not much, I think. Only avenues for games in interpreting symbols, which I have largely eschewed here. On the other hand, it's necessary for the opportunity it gives us to dismantle racial or classist stereotypes about the authors, which influence the way we read, whether we like it or not. And perhaps most importantly, a historical approach, a biographical approach, helps us to see how literature is made for people, and by people in a variety of social contexts. This is what connects literature to people, to life, ultimately, and what gives it its radical, rhizomatic, revolutionary power. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Yomi. Well, I think we may start our discussions by mentioning that your talk was widely lauded in the comment section. Many, very generous praise, all of which I think is well deserved, because your work is very, very thorough and very well put out. And one thing that I think I would like to do is start with Samuel Pinheiro's question. He seemed to be very interested in the matter of language in Tutuola's work and the comparison with Macunaíma. So I will put on screen here the first one. I will read it aloud for the sake of whoever might be only listening to the stream and not watching currently, but you have it on the screen as well. And he mentions that Macunaíma has broken the standard norms of language because the Brazilian moderns were seeking for an identity. And what are the similarities with Nigerian search for identity in Tutuola?
Well, I think the similarities are very powerful. It's a similar post-colonial context. In fact, Nigeria and Brazil have a history, kind of have an intertwined history that tied together by the transatlantic slave trade. And in Nigeria as well, we're dealing with the effects of this as much as we're dealing with the after effects of the British Empire setting up shop here for 100 years. So Nigeria has, I don't know how, God knows how many ethnic groups now, over 200 ethnic groups with their distinct languages, cultures. So we have to have, as a lingua franca, English. English is our lingua franca, as is Pidgin English, which is kind of similar to Jamaican Patois, for example. With the ethnic divisions as well, we also have class divisions, which I think have not really been analyzed historically, especially in literary study, in a way that would be fruitful. So you have the first crop of Nigerian writers who really achieve global fame was the generation just immediately after Tutuola. That's Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Christopher Okibo, who are writing in a very, very well-educated English that's smart of T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Shakespeare, Dickens, and can understand this need to assert this Caliban, to use the post-colonial metaphor, this need of Caliban to assert his mastery of the colonizer's language. Caliban says in Shakespeare's Tempest, Caliban says to Prospero, "This language you have learned me, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language." So I think most Nigerian writers in those early days concerned themselves with that counter attitude to the colonizers. I think as a result, we did not have the chance to really try to, bring things together and have this ethnogenetic movement that you had in Brazil. We're more concerned with just trying to establish Nigeria as a sovereign state politically, and trying to do away with racist assumptions about the abilities of African writers to come together and try to build a national identity. I think Tutuola, in fact, with his use of his non-standard English, which is not quite pidgin actually, he's really his own idiom. Maybe that's the way forward. And because of that, I think the greatest Nigerian artist. Hello?
Yomi, I believe we had some internet issues, but I think you are back already.
Yep. I think the Nigerian artist who has succeeded to the largest extent with his sexual identity is Fela Kuti, because he fashioned the style of singing, a lyrical style, which is in his own his own version of pidgin, which was it carried all through West Africa, not just in Nigeria. And he tried to create Nigerian identity through a socialist awakening of the people's consciousness, making us realize that there's not that much difference within us. Actually, I'd have liked to write an essay comparing Fela Kuti with Mario de Andrade. Maybe that'll be in the future. But yeah, those are the similarities and those are the differences. I hope that's clear enough.
No, absolutely. I think that's a very good answer. And I think that the relation between language and music and the construction of this national literary cultural project is a big similarity between Nigeria and Brazil. And of course, Mario de Andrade was a musician. He was very concerned with this relationship between music and literature in his works. But I think that even moving forwards in Brazilian history, that is something that is very, very much at the forefront of our concerns. And there are a few more questions in the comment sections, but there is one question of mine that I am very curious about. And I think I will cut in line first. Sorry, folks watching. I promise I'll give you more opportunities to ask questions. But I'm really curious about how you came up with the comparison between Tutuola and Mario de Andrade, because you make it sound so natural, so self-evident, but it's something that I had never seen before. And I think it's a topic that deserves further exploration, and I'm very curious to find out how that came to be. So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, I first read Macunaima the night before the first year exam. I'd done a module on the Brazilian novel at UCL, and I procrastinated. I hadn't read the novel during the term as I was supposed to. So I was reading the novel the night before the exam, and I thought I'd just read and maybe get some points or something. But I found myself enthralled by it. Like I read it. I read it in one sitting, like an hour and 30 minutes, something like that. And it's because I was so captured by the magical realism, the sense of Brazil. You could feel the heat coming off the page. And I think it's also just appealed to the Yoruba in me, or maybe the Nigerian in me, because it's so similar to childhood stories you hear, mythology. At that point, I'd not read Tutuola. I knew of Tutuola. I hadn't read him yet. And when I read Tutuola a couple of years ago, it was just, I mean, it's the same feeling, the same frisson that I got. And I didn't, I mean, I mentioned I was going to write about Andrade and Fela Kuti at first. But this idea just, it kept whispering in the back of my head. Like these works are so similar. They're so strikingly similar in their genesis, in their legacy, in the actual content as mythic novels, their post-colonial relevance. And these are post-colonial issues become more important to me for the last couple of years, I'll say personally. So I decided to just take the opportunity and write about them. Actually, I was surprised doing my research. I was so afraid I was going to see an article that had already done what I had in mind. But actually, no, I was surprised not to see anything.
Right. Thank you very much for sharing that. And now we have something else that Samuel asked about the relationship of language in the novel. And he talks about something very specific in Macunaíma, which is the use of a lot of words in indigenous language, mainly Tupi, but of course other languages as well. But the reader doesn't need to know them, and a Brazilian reader, oftentimes, and I draw this from my own experience reading the novel, doesn't understand, then you need some mediation, even as a Brazilian, to comprehend every single word. But it's not something that hinders the experience of reading the story. And he wants to know if there is the same effect in Tutuola's novel, and how this relation to, let's say, the other language, you know, undercutting the colonizer's language, how this takes place. I'm expanding a little bit on Samuel's point, but I think he would agree with me with this.
Well, Edward Glissant has this philosophy of opacité, and he believes that everybody or everything has the right to opacity. You don't have to understand everything. You can let things be obscure. It's part of the beauty of life, you see. Which I think Andrade achieves in Macunaima, and it's part of what gives it this enchanting, bewitching effect. And I mean, there's what Amy Césaire calls as well poetic knowledge. Poetic knowledge is not necessarily empirical. It's not always what you can put in a dictionary and get a definition of. From poetry, we get meaning that is not apparent, that we can't necessarily articulate. So I think we get that in Macunaima. We also get that in Tutuola. But on the level of language, Tutuola is crystal clear, I would say. Once you get used to the syntax, you don't really see any strange words. If there are strange words, he explains them. Maybe that has to do with his sense of inferiority or trying to make things as clear as possible. He has a very circumlocutory style, which he goes on and on, clarifies in brackets who exactly is speaking. I think it also has to do with the fact that he was hyper-correcting, because Yoruba is his native language. It's a very dense language, very poetic, very obscure. Yoruba people speak in parables and in proverbs. Tutuola tried not to do that. Or any proverb he used, he tried to explain them. And he didn't have the same, I mean, Mario de Andrade he names flora and fauna down to their, I mean, he's very specific. He doesn't just talk about a bird. It's like it has to be a very specific bird. It doesn't talk about a plant. It has to be a specific plant or palm or something. Tutuola, in one passage, he says, for lack of a better word, because I don't know the English word for it, I'll call it a bird similar to a sparrow. That's, I mean, he was not interested in the details of things in the same way. Yeah, Tutuola is very clear, but I think that's for reasons of translating out of being hyper aware of the complexities of his Yoruba language and trying to write in as clear English, a fable-like English. On the other hand, you have Diofagunwa, Tutuola's forebear, who wrote novels in Yoruba, who is one of the most complex writers you will ever read in any language, even for Yoruba. of Yoruba people of all literacy levels. I think it has to do with the personality of the writer, and it also has to do with the fact that Mario de Andrade was, for better or worse, we have to admit it, he was being consciously, this is a modernist trope, to be obscure for the sake of obscurity. Tutuola, on the other hand, was not. He just wanted to tell his story.
I think so, and a feeling I get reading Mario de Andrade, and it's one of the things that I love about him, is that he's always messing with the reader, especially in Macunaima. And I think that this obscurity and this like hyper detailed vocabulary is intended to do this effect, like, oh, you think you know Portuguese so well, you're so cultured. Think about his public, right? Even his peers. And it's like, okay, try to understand this. And he portrayed how much the sources that we as Brazilians have for our communication are wider than what standard formal culture, quote unquote, Portuguese was able to produce. And
Yes,
so
indeed.
Tutuola was not so concerned with provoking his readers in the same way, I imagine.
Yeah, yes.
Very well. So, Yomi, I believe that is all we have time for today, except, of course,
Okay.
for your final consideration. So, if you have anything else that you want to say, anything at all, really, the floor is yours. And thank you so much once again for your contribution to our project.
Thank you very much, Pedro. It's been wonderful. All I have to say is just please, if you haven't read these books, please read them. They'll change your life. They are wonderful. And these authors as well, they deserve to be read because, I mean, someone sits down one day and takes out a piece of paper and starts to write, and then to create something that maybe is immortal, maybe lasts for 100 years. It's a beautiful thing, I think. I think we should always bear this in mind, that the work of literature, I'm saying this as a Marxist as well, the work of literature is something that is produced by someone who labors for it, and is hard work. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you so very much. And speaking of that, for our Brazilian audience, the Palm Wine Drinkard is available on the Internet Archive for free. I know because I have begun reading it, and it is really just as enthralling as Yomi and the other people in the comment section have mentioned. And thank you so very much to you, Yomi, and to the audience. And in Portuguese, muito obrigado a todos que acompanharam hoje. I hope we may continue this conversation in the future, and have a great evening, everybody. Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, 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 ciao.
Thank you so very much.